Nikki unexpectedly saw her husband who had passed away 5 years ago. As the man approached her, Nikki quickly turned her head away. Not until the man walked past her did Nikki look back, watching the man's receding figure fade into the distance. It was as if her deceased husband had returned. Nikki then stealthily followed the man, this stranger and yet familiar figure. Nikki's longing for her husband grew stronger. 5 years ago, Nikki and her husband had come to the seaside to celebrate their anniversary. They were an old married couple, but the husband had still prepared a surprise for Nikki. After a romantic dinner, the husband invited Nikki to swim, but she did not accept. Yet it was this refusal that caused them to be eternally parted. An agonizing night of waiting, but her husband did not return. Nikki hurried to the beach to look for him, but all she saw was her husband lying on the sand. By then, he had already stopped breathing. Since that day, Nikki has lived in mourning for her husband. She would often take out his photo and softly touch his face to ease her longing for him. Sometimes, seeing someone with the same hairstyle as her husband, Nikki couldn't help but take a second look. She would drown her sorrows in alcohol, unaware even when the glass in her hand shattered. When she picked up the broken glass, she clutched the shards tightly in her palm, as if physical pain could alleviate the ache in her heart for her husband. Nikki endured 5 difficult years until she returned to this place. She wanted to visit the places she had been with her husband, but instead she saw a man who looked exactly like him. At that moment, Nikki's heart, which seemed dead, began to beat again. To get a better look at the man, she secretly followed him, all the way to the car park. But before she could reach him, the man drove away. However, Nikki was not one to give up easily, so for the following week, she came here every day, waiting for the man to appear again. Each time, she left disappointed. Finally, one day, as if her persistence had moved heaven, Nikki once again saw the man in the car park. But just as he was about to drive away, Nikki hurriedly got out of her car and greeted the man. But her voice was drowned out by the noise of the car. Then she chased after him in her car, even running a red light and nearly getting hit. Just when she was about to catch up with his car, she was blocked by a motorcycle at the traffic lights. Fortunately, Nikki saw the man's license plate. The first thing she did when she got home was to look up the man's information. It was then she learned the man was named Tom, an art professor at a university. Quickly getting hold of this information, Nikki arrived at the university, only to be struck speechless upon seeing again that face etched in her memory. At this moment, it was as if her beloved husband had returned. Nikki lost control of her emotions, and tears streamed down her face uncontrollably. 5 years ago, she witnessed her husband drown at sea. 5 years later, she encountered a man who looked exactly like her husband. Staring at the face she had longed for every day and night, Nikki burst into tears as if her beloved husband had returned. But after a brief conversation, an emotional Nikki hastily left. The next day, however, a calmer Nikki was sitting at the entrance of that school. To spend more time with the man, Nikki invited Tom to her home under the pretext of tutoring, and after leaving the address, she hurried away. Nikki's strange behavior didn't repel Tom. Instead, it made him develop a liking for this woman. The next day, Tom arrived at Nikki's house using the address. But she, who was supposed to be learning to paint, didn't focus on it at all and spent the whole time gazing at Tom absent-mindedly. Gradually, Tom realized that Nikki didn't really want to paint. However, as they spent time together, their relationship began to warm up. One day, Tom was relaxing in the water, but when Nikki saw this, she was overwhelmed with fear. The image of her husband's drowning resurfaced before her eyes. She quickly pulled Tom out of the water. Seeing how Nikki was so anxious about him, Tom's dormant heart was awakened. After returning home, Tom poured his affection for Nikki into his painting, as if in this way Nikki could appear by his side. Finally, one day she could no longer control herself, and Nikki made a phone call. She invited him to dinner. So Nikki took him to a restaurant she regularly visited with her husband, as if everything was the same as it was 5 years ago. The chef, thinking he was the regular patron from before, greeted Tom enthusiastically, which made him a bit uncomfortable, but this didn't affect Tom from expressing his feelings. The familiar environment and the familiar face made Nikki unable to distinguish who the man before her was. The two kissed each other uncontrollably. The moment she realized it, Nikki pushed Tom away. Obviously, Nikki was not ready to accept the man before her, which made Tom start to doubt. Until now, Nikki had not told Tom about their similar looks, as she was also uncertain whether the man before her had entered her heart or if she simply saw him as a substitute for her husband. Until one day, they walked down the street. Nikki stopped in front of a shop window. Thinking Nikki wanted him to try on a suit inside, Tom entered without a thought. Unexpectedly, seeing him in the suit reminded Nikki of her deceased husband, and she even softly called out her husband's name. At that moment, Tom understood everything. Back home, Tom vented his frustration. The next day, Nikki's daughter came to see her from Seattle, but when she saw Tom, she almost broke down. Because she couldn't accept that the man her mother had fallen for resembled her deceased father so closely. Nikki introduced her boyfriend to her daughter, but upon first seeing the man, the daughter was almost on the verge of breaking down. Because the man bore such a striking resemblance to her late father, she emotionally reproached and told Tom to leave, resulting in Tom being knocked down in the scuffle. But as she got up to leave, Nikki called out her husband's name. It was only then that the daughter realized her mother was still living in the memory of her father. However, Tom received a call from Nikki in the evening asking him to accompany her on an outing. Despite hesitations, Tom agreed because Nikki was the love of his life. After 5 years, Nikki returned to this familiar place, filled with fond memories of herself and her husband expressing joy and happiness. But she failed to notice Tom's downcast mood. During dinner out, Nikki even mistook Tom for her husband, reminiscing about the time he asked her to dance. When Tom went to the service counter, he discovered a photograph left by Nikki and her husband from years past. At that moment, Tom finally realized he was just a substitute. He took down the photo and returned to the table, asking Nikki why she hadn't told him, but Nikki stubbornly denied it. Tom then produced a photo of the two of them. It was then that Nikki understood Tom knew everything. Feeling adrift, she stood up and left, leaving Tom all alone. Tom chased Nikki to the seaside, the place where she had lost her husband. Without looking back, Nikki rushed into the sea, letting the waves engulf her. As Nikki swam further away, Tom, disregarding his own safety, stopped her dangerous act and successfully brought her back to shore. However, Nikki mistook Tom for her deceased husband, regretting that she didn't join him in swimming that year. In her emotional breakdown, she clung to Tom. To alleviate Nikki's emotions at that moment, Tom was willing to be a stand-in, but no one expected that this would be their last embrace. A year later, Nikki received an invitation to an art exhibition. When she arrived, she shockingly learned from Tom's ex-wife that Tom had been ill for a long time, and he had passed away not long after they separated. Nikki was greatly shaken by the news. Following the ex-wife's direction, Nikki discovered every painting was of herself. Only then did she understand Tom's entire world consisted only of her, yet she could only live as a shadow in his world. To love someone deeply is blissful, but the pain of losing a loved one cuts deep. We can never live as someone else, nor can we become someone else. If you meet someone who loves you, please let go of your burdens and accept them bravely.